Welcome to this panel talk on external funding grants in the arts and humanities. My name is Carolyn Bradley, and this talk is hosted by my office, the Office of Research Development. Please note that this talk is being recorded. I am the Arts and Humanities Funding Specialist for my office, and my job is to foster a culture of pursuing grants amongst our arts and humanities faculty, and also provide proposal development assistance. If any of you are interested in applying for a grant, please reach out to me anytime, and I can help you no matter what stage of the process you find yourself in. Whether you still need to identify relevant funding opportunities, or if you have already selected a program to apply for and would like help preparing an application. My email address is cbradley@fsu.edu. I'll put that in the chat. I wanted to hold this talk today because many arts and humanities faculty have expressed that they know very little about what kinds of funding grants are available to people in their fields and what the process of applying for and completing these grants looks like. Even as arts and humanities faculty are becoming increasingly attuned to the value of fellowships, the idea of pursuing grants remains something of a mystery. Importantly, whereas fellowships are typically made out to individuals, grants are typically made out to institutions. So when you apply for a funding grant, you will usually be applying on behalf of FSU. In some cases, you might be applying on behalf of an independent component of FSU, such as the Museum of Fine Arts or the Mancy Dance and Choreographic Research Center. I say this just because faculty members have told me that they were perusing grant solicitations eligibility criteria, and they'll see that the program is only available to institutions, and they think they can't apply. They feel like only maybe advanced, senior leadership at FSU can apply for these, but that's not true. As a professor at FSU, you're entitled to apply on behalf of our university. You do need your chair's approval and possibly your dean's if you will be requesting cost share or course release. But after you receive your chair's approval, you can reach out to me and we can put together a comprehensive to-do list and checklist of materials you'll need to complete your application, and we can go from there. Joining us today for the talk are 3 FSU faculty members in the arts and humanities who have all won prestigious funding grants. Ansje Burdick from the School of Dance, Michael Carrasco from Department of Art History, and Laura McTighe from the Department of Religion have agreed to share about their experiences winning grants. Ms. Ansje Burdick has been awarded multiple National Endowment for the Arts grants, which have helped support the Maggie Allesee National Center for Choreography, or Mancy. Ms. Burdick collaborated with Ms. Carla Peterson, also from FSU School of Dance, to secure these grants, which have typically ranged from $30,000 to $45,000. Dr. Michael Carrasco was awarded in 2020 a National Endowment for the Humanities Collaborative Research Grant. His project is titled The Origins of Writing in Early Mesoamerica. Dr. Carrasco is collaborating with Dr. Joshua Engelhardt from FSU's Department of Anthropology, and the grant is worth about $250,000. He will also discuss his 2014 NEH Digital Humanities Startup Grant. His project was titled The Mesoamerican Corpus of Formative Period Art and Writing. That grant was for about $60,000. And Dr. Laura McTighe was awarded in 2022 a grant from the Henry Luce Foundation for a new collaborative public humanities project, Creating the World Anew, Religion, Economy, and Mutual Aid. Dr. McTighe is collaborating with Dr. Elaine Oliphant from NYU in the Anthropology and Religious Studies, and Dr. Daniel Vaca from Brown University, also in Religious Studies, and that grant's for about $250,000. The speakers will each present for about 15 minutes. Then we'll open the floor for questions from the audience. I appreciate you being here. Okay, Ansje, would you be willing to start?
Sure, thank you. Yeah, thanks, Carolyn. So my name is Ansje Burdick. I know it's a tough name, so I always say I answer to anything nice. I'm happy to talk with anyone about these grants afterward, if helpful. I'm the managing director at the Maggie Allesee National Center for Choreography, which is a choreographic research center located in the FSU School of Dance. And our mission is to raise the value of the creative process in dance. Mancy is one of only 2 creative residency centers in the United States, and we're the only one located in a Research One university. Um, so sorry, we host 9 to 15 residencies a year. Are funded from 3 major sources. Our staff, salary staff, are funded by the state funds by FSU. We get funds from an endowment that was made by Maggie Elsey herself. Maggie Elsey was one of FSU's initial lettered cheerleaders. And if you've been to a recent homecoming parade, you may have seen her in the homecoming parade. So make sure you wave. And we also get grants sources for our programming. So that's what I'm going to talk a little bit about today. I've had the honor of working with 2 different directors since 2010 in the pursuit of grant funding for Mansi. One was Jennifer Kalianis and the other Carla Peterson, both of who are very seasoned grant writers. So I'm going to talk a little bit today about from the perspective of a co-PI in the grant pursuit of grants. And I want to start by sharing my screen. Let me see if I can do that. There, does that work? Can you all see my screen? Yes, excellent.
Yes.
Okay. So I just want to start. Mansi is an artist-centered organization, so it feels really appropriate for us to start with our artists here. Let's see. This is our spring lineup, and we host nationally significant choreographers and their collaborators for 1 to 2 week residencies, with a focus on providing time and space for the exploration of a creative process. And these are our lead choreographers on this page, and they're invited to bring collaborators, musicians, dancers, lighting designers, etc. And they sometimes engage with our students and the community as they develop their projects. Some of these artists will be hosting public showings. So if you're interested in any of these artists and you want to get on our mailing list, we're happy to have you come over and check out their work in the School of Dance. The dance field tends to support product commissioning for final presentations and full works, and there's less opportunities for creative process funding. Mansi pursues funding that's out there, and you can see on this slide for our current artists some of our funding from the Mellon Foundation and the NEA and a McTighe partnership. Okay, move ahead here. So since 2010, Mansi's received Mellon Foundation support, which is really critical to our work, since it not only supports multi-year residencies, but it's also provided support for new initiatives, including commissioning writings, embedded writing program, and archive residency. It serves as a match for our NEA proposals, and it also supports a part-time research associate. So our Mellon funding is incredibly important. It's listed there at the top. I realized in looking at these slides later that it wasn't particularly clear which ones were Mellon and which ones were NEA. The larger funds are from the Mellon Foundation, and the smaller ones are from the 40,000 are from the NEA. So in addition to Mellon, we apply annually to the NEA, and we've received funds from the NEA every year, knock on wood, since 2006. Just a note on NEA funds. If you're going to go in for an NEA and you've never gone in for one before, typically you start in the $10,000 range. So you begin asking at $10,000 and you spend a couple of years at 10, demonstrating that you can completely fulfill your NEA proposals. And then you spend some time at 20 and then at 30, and then you get to 40, and we're at the 40, 45 level at the moment, with hopes to go up. Although in the NEA, we're kind of reaching the ceiling there. And also just to note that these, the NEA listings here, although they say 2 residencies or 3 residencies, those funds are really utilized to support our full season. So although we write to the NEA about 2 artists or 3 artists, the funding that we get, we typically utilize to support more than 2 or 3 artists. And then finally, we augment our Mellon and NEA funds with smaller pots of money. And here I was just showing we received from funds. I was a PI on a Sustainable Arts Foundation. We've received funding since 2018, ranging from $2,000 to $4,000. And these are pretty small, but I think what they do is demonstrate our responsiveness to artists' needs and how we're fleshing out and really augmenting the main support, right? So when we apply to the NEA and we can put in that we've been thoughtful about, we're going to invite artists that are parents and we're going to fund their childcare and things like that when they come into residence, I think it makes a nicer story. Let's see. All of these grants are super critical to the work that we do. State funds from FSU provide important resources, right? Our staffing and facilities and maintenance, and we have fantastic access to scholars. But without the support from the NEA and Mellon, our programs would really be diminished. Carolyn asked if we would share a budget. And I was not very successful in pulling a real budget into my PowerPoint presentation, but I did manage to put in this kind of and what I thought I would talk about with this is I really feel like budgets tell a story, right? This story that we're trying to tell with this budget is that if the NEA funds an artist residency, there are a lot of staff that are parties. So we're always very conscious about that. It is also showing our cost share. So here you can see this is an NEA budget, but we pulled in funding from Mellon to augment what the NEA residencies are, what the NEA is supporting. We might also put in here, and that's not on this page, but the funding from the Sustainable Arts Foundation or other pieces to just showcase that we are thinking about full support for the artist. Also not on this budget, but I think wanted to note is again, thinking about your budget that tells a story. So for example, we have a deaf artist, Antoine Hunter, who's coming to be with us this spring. And when we wrote for that NEA, we were very careful to put in ASL interpretive, a line to pay for ASL interpreters in support of Antoine's residency. I think, it's critical for his residency. We're not able to communicate without that. And we don't want that weight of that to be on the artist. We wanted it to be funded by the NEA and by MANCI. So just thinking about the budget as telling a story and what is the story that you're telling with how you put your budget together. We do enjoy support from our University Business Administration staff when we're putting together these budgets, and especially in the salary and wages section, and cost share, which can get very complicated. So that's really helpful. We rely a lot on Diane and Anna on that. Okay, let's see. And I'm sure there may be questions about cost share in the question section. I'm happy to talk about the tangle that is cost share. Carolyn sent us a couple of questions to consider when we were putting these together. And as I answer those, I wanted to just share a slide or two from our residencies. This is artist Beth Gill, who came to MANCI in 2020 and again in 2022 on a project titled Nail Biter, which was started in the pandemic, which seems like a very appropriate title for a project in the pandemic. Gill was supported by NEA, Mellon, and the Sustainable Arts Foundation funding. The Sustainable Arts Foundation funding, again, is for parent artists, and you can see the legs of Beth's baby kind of looks like coming out of Beth's head there when she's lying on the floor. And also, I just wanted to showcase how MANCI engages with scholars on campus. So here you can see our own Carolyn Henney and Rob Duarte from Fine Arts in these photos that are supporting and helping Beth as she's creating some set pieces for her work. One of the questions that Carolyn asked us to consider was how grant writing has contributed to our career. And I would just say that my role as a co-PI for external grants and a PI on internal grants has obviously contributed directly to my promotion alongside my service, but it's also raised my profile in the national field at that level. And this is something that I think I've learned from our director, Carla Peterson, and her experience in the grant field is that writing a grant is really writing a story, right? You're writing a story via narrative and you're writing a story via the budget. And that story is being read by a panel of people that are really steeped in the field and deeply connected to the field. And whether you're funded or not, they're reading your story. And so they're getting to know you and they're getting to know your organization. And when you do walk away and don't get funded, which hopefully doesn't happen very often, they've still read your story, right? And they're still connecting who you are into the field. So I feel like that's an important note. One other question here. This is my last slide, and I guess I just wanted to add a couple of pieces of maybe advice, and I'm sure there'll be more questions. But one is, if you're applying for an NEA grant, reach out to the NEA. And I would say, Mellon is a grant funding organization that invites you. So we have to be invited in order to apply. But when applying a cold to the NEA, definitely reach out and talk with their grants administrators. That's what they're there to do. They love talking with you. It's not so much about bouncing the idea. They're not going to tell you that's a good idea or that's a bad idea, but they're going to give you lots of guidance on how to, they're there. They want to give you the money. I would say, don't be afraid of them. Reach out to them. Reach out to the resources at FSU. MANCI hasn't done that as much, mostly because we've worked with directors that have been seasoned. I have to say, Carla Peterson's intern, Sarah Nash, now runs the National Endowment for the Arts Dance grant project. So for Carla, she has a long history in the field. So it's a little bit different when you're starting out. I would say reach out for as much help as you can possibly get. And then finally, I just want to, and then my other advice is start early with sponsored research. Start really early. And then finally, I just, Carolyn had asked, what kind of I'm not sure the question was, why do you do what you do? But I just want to say, when you're in the middle of it, this photo is from Netta Yerushalmi's residency movement. She was here in 2022. And when you're in that middle of that, the budget's not balancing, sponsored research has asked you for another something, and it's not coming together. And you're wondering, why am I writing this grant? I'm never going to get the money. Go to the studio, go in the studio, and this is what you see. This is what I do. And then I remember, oh yeah, this is why I do what I do. So I just want to end on that note.
Thank you, Ansje. That was lovely. Okay, Michael, could you go next?
Okay, let me try to share my screen and let's see. I think. Can you see that? Is that the first
That's
slide?
good. That's
okay.
perfect.
Okay. Well, thank you for having me. I'm going to try to follow the questions that Carolyn gave us to address, and my research has been a little bit different. I mean, I feel now very selfish because I'm not sharing it as much as MANCI, but my work is focused on writing and Mesoamerican art from the formative period, so about 1000 BC to about 900 AD on the Olmec and Maya. And so these are just some examples here. And I thought I would start out by just going over the grants that I have received and talking a little bit about some of that, the process there and what I've learned from that experience, and then move on to those other set of questions. I hope that isn't too small. I tried to get on one page, and I started with the earliest first, which was the NEH, and most of mine have come from the National Endowment for the Humanities. There have been some other ones, some that are not listed through the Japanese government, but that was something that was somewhat separate. And then this, the third one here is from basically the Mexican equivalent of the National Science Foundation. And I was a co-PI on that. So I'll talk a little bit about that because that involves collaborations that are still ongoing and probably leading to our next grant. But the main ones that I'll focus on are the ones that Carolyn had mentioned, which are the NEH ones. And so the first one that I received working with Joshua Engelhardt, who had just graduated at that time from anthropology. He now is at teaches in Mexico, is this digital humanities startup grant. And I think one of the things I wanted to emphasize in this is that I've used CRC planning grants and COFRs as a seed for starting these other grants. And I found that to be pretty effective because it shows the granting agency that you've already done a certain amount of work on it. And so you'll notice this one was supported by a planning grant that started some of our initial research. And so we were able to turn that into materials that were actual proof of concept really for the larger grant. And notice I've also indicated here that I applied for this grant twice. So that's something that when I was a graduate student, I'd apply for things, I didn't get it. I was, horribly upset and mad. And then I learned over the years, although probably far later than I should have, that I just need to be calm and endure and apply again and again. So what we did with this is we got a set of feedback, and then we just went through and made those changes. And it was, so I applied for it twice, and then we eventually got it. And that grant itself then served as a foundation for many years later for the number 4 here, which is the collaborative grant, which was a larger grant that pulls all that research together from basically research from 2014, or actually 2012 all the way to the present. In between that time, I'd also got an NEH fellowship, which I know is not the topic of today, because we're talking about grants that go through sponsored research rather than individual buying time out from teaching. But this was an important one because it also, I think, shows that once you develop a relationship, just kind of like what Nancy has with the melon, once you have a relationship with an institution, a granting agency, and you've delivered something on it, I think that really does influence their perception of your ability to produce and carry through on the things that you say you're going to do, even if they aren't exactly the fruits of what you said you were going to do. So with the NEH Digital Humanities, we said we were going to create a website, and we were working with Dennis Slice, and then deceased now, sadly, but in scientific computing. And that didn't materialize. But we had a lot of other things that came out of it that we weren't expecting. So there's a kind of element of chance that goes into that. And we presented those as kinds of different fruits that we weren't expecting. And I think that was something that was a positive experience that came out of that I think influenced what I could, how I could present myself in this other competition that they had with the fellowship. So those are, and again, this NEH fellowship I also included here because it was initially, that research was initially supported by a CRC grant, a COFRS grant. So I was able to say in that application that my institution believes in me, and I've done this preliminary research, and I can give you these fruits and point to these publications that came out during the time that I was working under the COFRs and at other moments. And then the psychid research, which is a little bit different than my writing, but still ties into formative period Mesoamerica. That one, because it's a Mexican funding agency, I was not, couldn't be a PI, and I was working with someone in the National Genomics Lab there. And this is, of course, starts to sound like it veers more and more into the sciences, which it does in her section of the work. But I was able, my kind of niche within that was talking about the representation of these plants within formative period art and kind of in between art history and archaeology. And I think this is another way in which the arts and humanities have a way of intersecting with the sciences too, and being part of funding applications, even if you aren't the direct PI, is because we have something to say about the dimensions of human experience that dovetail naturally, because we aren't in reality is analog and not digitally composed into the discrete fields that we've managed to create for ourselves. So this was kind of an interesting one to really, in terms of the challenge of communication between scientists. I remember Angelica, who is the PI for it, initially asked us, well, I know what I can do for you, but what can you do for me? Now, I think she's changed that that tone over the years that we worked together, but I think trying to speak that language from a different discipline is difficult. And this a little bit that was the same way with Dennis Slice too in scientific computing, was how do I describe what I want to achieve in a language that they understand, and vice versa, how can I understand what they're telling me about the limitations? And that takes a lot of time. So in starting out, if you're working with other people in collaboration, which I think there's a lot of opportunities for grants in the arts in collaboration, it takes time to learn each other's language. So starting off early and then trying to develop some sense of what that other field is an important part of the process, that I think it will lead into one of the questions that comes later about what are some of the difficulties or challenges to grant making in the arts. And I think that that's probably one of them, especially since that effort is sometimes not really valued in terms of department P&T structures. So I think that is something to consider. It's so in that sense, it's both a pleasure to learn about something else and expands one's intellectual horizons. But on the other hand, you have to think about in terms of the time it takes to really lay that groundwork and whether it's dovetailing with the expectations of the department that you're in. And then finally, the NEH Collaborative Grant is in a sense a continuation of what we started in digital humanities and started in the CRC planning grant, where we're pulling that information together into a book project. So this is the collaborative grant focused on publication. And it's not just publishing something, but they want to know how it's going to reach the public. What's its impact on broader intellectual trends? That's something that NEH is really interested in hearing about. And writing in Mesoamerica is a pretty esoteric subject. So how do you make something like that interesting and seem relevant to people is, I think, a challenge for any research area. But let me just say, if we can make early Mesoamerican writing seem relevant to people, then you can probably make your work seem doubly relevant to people, because it's pretty obscure. So our pitch with that was that the Americas in the study of the history of writing had largely been left out or diminished because it's not alphabetic scripts. Maya script is a logosyllabic script like Japanese. So what we say in investigating the idea of the origins of writing is partly bringing the Americas to the table in that discussion, but also even more broadly is what does it mean to talk about writing as a human communication system at a time when information and exchange and communication is ramping up in ways that are much faster across international in scope in these last, with the internet. So there's ways of tying in esoteric subjects into things that have meaning that the panel of experts can see, okay, this isn't just speaking to this sign means something to the ancient Olmec, but the study of this material actually has relevance for thinking about how humans have communicated with one another and how those systems have developed. And so by looking at the simplicity, that transition, or some of the kind of more easily isolatable moments when, let's say, iconography becomes writing, then we can think about how the impact of that process is on human cognition as we increase the abstraction and complexity of those systems. So anyway, I mean, I think we phrased it better in the proposal, but that's one way of it's important to make the case that there's something, that there's an impact from it. Okay, so we can come back to any of those questions. I've also been a panelist for review on the collaborative grant. And it's an interesting process because I know that that was one of the things that people did look for in that review process. They looked to see what accomplishments had been made if they had received previous NEH funding. Were people asking for funding just to maintain what they were already doing? I mean, this is an archaeological section, so a lot of people are applying each year or every 3 years for funding to continue in excavation or some other site work. And so there was a real examination of what new was going to come out of it, or what impact that was going to have on, let's say, archaeological education of a visiting public. So those were things that were important components to the reviewers. Also, what was important and what the grant agent had said to us as reviewers was, did they make the changes that were suggested if they had applied before? So that goes back to that idea. If you apply once and you get recommendations, then, and you address those recommendations, that's a very important step in that process, at least for the NEH. So maybe there'll be some other questions that come out of that, but those were some of the points that, from my experience of applying to these, those were some of the things that came most to mind. I did manage to pull out the budget. I don't know if you can see it on a smaller screen, but I'm happy to share this budget with anyone who asks in the whole application, in fact, if you'd like. So feel free to reach out to me. It's pretty straightforward in this budget for the NEH collaborative grant, because it's basically just paying for salary components for Josh and I, and then also travel, and then some consulting fees with cultural heritage imaging. The budget from the Digital Humanities Startup Grant, that was more complex because we were also supporting a student. And some of the waivers came from art history, some of the waivers came from scientific computing. And so we had to, that was a very complicated thing to work out. I guess in another experience that was challenging in terms of the budgeting is a lot of the humanities grants really don't have enough money to support students if you also have to pay for waivers. So that's something to also think about. If you want to support a student stipend, that's one thing, but you'll want to get really talk to your department, either the chair and then maybe also the dean, depending on the structure of your college. Are they willing to let one of those GA positions go, or one of those waiver positions go, to help on this grant if you're paying the stipend? And that could change from year to year, so that's something to consider, and another reason to start fairly early in the process. Those stipends, though, should be able to come in. The waivers, I believe, maybe Carolyn, you have tell me if I'm wrong, that those could be part of cost sharing, though, or like in kind contribution. That's another area that's complex. I haven't figured out exactly how to calculate all those things. So, and that's all to say that this budget is relatively simple compared to what a budget could be if you had to bring in all those different features into it. One of the challenges with this is that in our college, at least, we don't have a dedicated person focused on helping to develop the budgets. So in that case, for me, I was really relying on working with our departmental person, Sherry, and a little bit with and now with some other people in the dean's office, Rachel Collins, to work on these budgets. But they were largely ones that Josh and I developed and then sent to sponsored research. And we tried to start early, but I think one of the challenges, they are working with people who have dedicated staff who've already looked through and developed it. So when they receive it, they're not really processing it and reviewing it in the way that that I think that some of us need. And so that's a challenge that in another role that I have on the Council for Associate Deans for Research, we have been looking at ways of addressing that issue, because we get feedback from this 5 days before the grants due. Oh, there's a big mistake here. You have to fix that. Well, we sent it for review 2 months before that. So there are some issues of communication that I think are a challenge for us with those of us who lack dedicated grant support. And I think that Carolyn, I know that you've helped in the last grant that we had go through, or one of the recent grants we had go through in the College of Fine Arts. And I think that your help and assistance in outlining those steps was a big help for seeing that go through in a more smooth process. So I think that my experience in the past might be something that's in the past, but it is something to think about as you put your project together. And again, that means starting early. Let's see. So I have some pictures of things that I've done. I think that I'll just jump to, so these are more sexy pictures of 3D scans of some of the objects that we've been able to do. We didn't, and some of these came out of the 2014 Digital Humanities startup one. And this was something we didn't think we were going to do on that grant, because neither Josh or I knew how to do 3D scanning in 2014. But I saw that it might be possible with certain programs, so we experimented and had fun. And this was one of the things that the NEH was most impressed with. And that's the other thing I'd say, moving into the question of what has it done for your career and or for your own intellectual development, maybe is a good way of putting it, is the funding. This funding has allowed me to experiment and have intellectual play in a way that I wouldn't have had if I hadn't had that funding. And it's made me extend my own thinking of what I could do in ways that I probably wouldn't have done if I hadn't had the support that it offered. And so that's I think an exciting, in addition to doing all the things that I thought I was going to do and planned on doing, it's helped do that. And it's also allowed me to go to places and work with a lot of people, especially in Mexican institutions, whom I wouldn't have had interaction and contact with. And that's opened up doors not only for me, but for my students as well. And so I think that that's an important piece of that development, besides just, adding, to the richness or maybe amount of publications, or even, and of course, publications and presentations and one's standing or presence in the field, because you're circulating more, and the more people see you, the more they know you. So all those things that you might expect would happen. The other dimension is this kind of dimension of play, I think, which is intellectual play. Some of the play also extended back into collaborations with Carolyn Henney of 3D printing. This is only 4th scale of one of the Olmec heads, and this was a proof of concept for their large format printer. So this wasn't exactly funded by the grant. We didn't think we were going to do it, but it was a kind of fruit that came off and was useful to do something for the college, and for us to think about what we could do in this case when FAR was doing more with 3D printing. And I think one of the things that they also like to hear about in the NEH is how is their funding going to impact the public, of course, who are paying for your grant, but also in your teaching. And so in this slide is a class that we're working on 3D scanning photogrammetry in the collections here. And so this isn't really, these are Andean objects, probably a Inca period gold object, and then this Nazca effigy vessel. And these aren't part of the material that I normally work on, but the students were able to participate in scanning and using the technologies that came out of that play, and the experimentation that the grant allowed. And so we worked with, that's become part of an aspect of our program and educational experience for our graduate students. This student here, Chase, he's graduated. He went on to work in scanning, and now he works for Neo Matrix, which is a scanner company, and is doing all kinds of things. And he recently posted on his social media, he has the best job in his life, or that anyone could want for, hope for. And to me, you know, that's a really satisfying thing to see, that he wouldn't have had those experiences if we hadn't done the work that we did and just played around with the 3D scanning, and then expanded that into a bigger and bigger component, and then brought that skill into our curriculum. So that's a very satisfying part of that experience. Now, the challenges, I'll go back just to, well, I don't want to leave on a bad note, but I do think one of the challenges for the arts and humanities is the P&T issue. I think it's a push to kind of think about, what does that mean for is this kind of work valued? Now, if it leads to a book or something that is seen as kind of the fruit that's valued, then yes, it does. But there's a lot of time that's taken up in creating those collaborations, in being away sometimes, or trying to learn new things that will support that the work that you're doing. And I'm not sure if that's always being registered in the ways that it should be. So that's a little bit my concern, especially for assistant professors. That would be a little bit my concern about that. You want to really keep track of that. And then on the positive end, you know, despite that danger, and I'm sure it set me back in certain ways, I probably would do it all again the way I wanted to do it, because it seems to be very satisfying. And for me, it's been intellectually satisfying, and I still have a job, so they haven't gotten rid of me. And I just think that there's a lot of potential for, well, okay, there's a lot of potential for the arts and humanities to extend our to these funding opportunities that we normally haven't looked at as much, although NEA, of course, we have, and NEH to some extent. But I think there's more opportunities. And I think that those kinds of partnerships that exist, where we have to think about not funding the entirety of our project, but thinking about what kind of thing could we, element of a project, can we get funded through something, and then pitching it to that portion of it, rather than trying to get the whole thing funded. So if you apply to the NEH fellowship, you're giving your whole shtick of what you want to do for, you know, let's say a book. But maybe it's only part of it that you can get funding in the collaboration with, let's say, that SciKid grant in Mexico, because it's only going to be a small component of the larger grant. So you really have to narrate it in a different way. And I'm not sure, or at least my training was that I wasn't trained to really do that. And it took a process of kind of coming to terms with that. But, you know, other people are probably faster learners. So, but that would be my pitch to thinking about grants that you might not have thought about as a way of expanding your reach and getting support for broader aspects of your work. So thank you. Let me see if I can stop.
Thank you,
sharing.
Michael. That was wonderful. Okay, and last is Laura. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And it's been wonderful to be present with and to learn from both of you. I have the lovely privilege of going at the end, which means hopefully I can also stitch together some of the thoughts that are coming up. I'm curious, are you all seeing now the open slides, but not in share?
Yes.
Not in slide view
Yes.
mode? Okay, then that did not do that quite correctly.
Oh.
I'm not sure why I am not seeing the part of where you just push play. My apologies, I had opened this previously, so we would not be having this moment. Slideshow.
Are you trying to flip it so that we see the presentation?
No. I just had a moment of gap because we've stopped using Zoom quite as much, so my memory of how to start a slideshow was lagging. So thank you again to Carolyn, especially for bringing us all together for this. I'm really delighted to be able to share some insights from the work of both building the concept for creating the world anew, working with the funder around being able to secure support, and also the very beginning stages of launching this project. I'm actually just back from our first major core group meeting, which that language will make a little bit more sense soon, but actively in the midst of launching a project. So this is one that is at much earlier stages than what Ansje and Michael shared with you. But I think that also it helps to be able to offer different insights into how to move through different steps of the grants process. I wanted to begin also by underlining something that Michael had shared. This is actually the second major grant that I've won from the Henry Luce Foundation. And Michael shared the piece about how building relationships with funders is one of the keys for them beginning to understand you, your work, the type of commitments that you bring. And I think that is absolutely true for the sort of the first project is another grant that's housed here at FSU that is centered in community-driven research in the South. And it was part of how I became legible as one of the 3 PIs for creating the world anew as somebody doing community-driven work in the humanities. Carolyn shared the names of my fellow principal investigators, and I use that language intentionally. Elaine Oliphant and Daniel Baca. We've worked to build this project as one where we are all equal fellow PIs. And that's one of the things I'll touch on at the end of what it's looked like for us to try to translate the spirit of humanities research into modes that have been made more for social sciences and scientists. So to begin, this project is one that grew out of many things, but one of them, I think most acutely for a lot of us, out of the pandemic and out of pushes that were happening in all sort of sectors to question the world as it was, to question how survivable our present was, where people were put into many different modes of sheltering in place, kind of raising questions for people that didn't have homes to be going to, and how are we going to meet our basic needs. I put up this quote from Miriam Kaba. She's one of my dear friends and touchstones, but this is one of the questions that as Dan, Elaine, and I were coming together, that was really central for us. We were connected to different mutual aid efforts in our local communities. We were all equally scholars of religion, and we're present at a moment in our field where religious studies has increasingly been trying to ask, what is the relevance of our work to the movements for change on the ground? And I think for any of you who are part of fields that have divisions between scholarship and practice, you'll understand that getting to those normative questions can also often be a challenge for scholars and a sort of anxiety producing space for challenge for scholars. So we really tried to lean into that there were many openings in our world, but one of them that we saw in our field was a willingness to ask normative questions that hadn't previously been present. So to really think as scholars, what are the effects of our work in the world, and how can we be part of producing scholarship that is realizing and extending change? So to Miriam's question, these are the 2 that we began working with. And our process of formulating this grant really was easily a year-long process, meeting every single week, sometimes for 4-hour meetings, to be talking through ideas, building our relationships with one another, working through every facet of the grant. And I'm going to use more text-heavy slides than my colleagues. I wanted that to be here in part, knowing that some people will be checking in for the recording after, and it'll be an easy way of taking notes so you don't have to scramble, or if I in any way cut out audibly. So these were the 2 questions that we added to Miriam's. If there's the sort of big, if things aren't working, what can you build? Then also knowing that the answers to that question are happening all around us. So we started by wanting to understand what is going on around us that we would like to amplify. Where do we see glimmers of this new world, new work taking shape? And those questions drove us to building a vision for the project. I wrote this out long form. I'm not going to read the entire text for you. I'll sort of talk through pieces of it. But I think a piece of this, my colleagues Dan and Elaine were coming out of having started a unit in our national or international professional association on religion and economy. And what they were observing in the context of that was that scholars of religion and economy were very good at critiquing what was happening, but much less strong in building constructive solutions for how things might be done otherwise. And that was really a terrain that this project could open up. And open up not only for kind of forward-looking work, for thinking about what are new things we could build in the present moving forward, but also for thinking differently with how we can use our scholarly tools to excavate histories of the past that have been more buried, to be working alongside community groups, to be centering long traditions of community knowledge in the modes that they are produced, not necessarily the modes that they might be recognized in the academy. And that doing all of this work actually brought us into a different relationship between scholarship and practice. And that being one of the really key points that we wanted to carry forward from our very long and meticulous study of the practices of mutual aid, that rather than there being the sort of scholarship that you disseminate, and that's what practice looks like, that theory actually being built in the midst of practicing differently was one of the pieces we wanted to bring to this project. So in translating that vision into something that could look like a grant, and this I really loved, to your point that what you're doing with any grant and with any project is telling a story. And that's part of what I've tried to center in the slides that are to come. The vision that we had for this project, we also had to translate into concrete things that would make sense to the funder. One of the things that I knew from the previous the other grant that I was working on was that the funder, the Henry Luce Foundation, was beginning to undertake a really deep investment in non-traditional knowledge makers and centering collaborative grants that were working between people in more traditional spaces like universities, but then also working in collaboration with nonprofit organizations, with religious organizations. So our first goal was recognizing that we shared that vision and those commitments, and that was one of the things that we wanted to make actionable through this project, was to bring on board a cohort of people who came from a really diverse set of orientations to questions of mutual aid. So scholars, practitioners, artists, activists, and to recognize that there was something new that could come from building a conversation with those complexities of orientations. Another, and this sort of goes to some of the bits that I said already about the blind spots and biases within our field, and also some of the pieces of where we wanted to push and open, that we hoped that by bringing that community together, that we would be able to identify and cultivate new directions in the study and practice of religion, economy, and mutual aid. So both things that could shape the field of religion, but also had real meaningful impact on the ground. And that led us into number 3, which was figuring out how this grant could be a way of expanding and leveraging support for different projects that were happening. One of the sort of often, one of the things that comes back to me often from a quote from Miriam Kaba from a webinar that's been one of our inspirations for some of the disseminating work we want to do, 1 million experiments. And she talked about how part of why we don't know as much about mutual aid work is that it's so poorly under-resourced. And that one of the simplest things that we could do to be able to, and again, to tell the story of what this project was about, is to be able to better resource the work that's already happening on the ground. And to, in doing so, that hit to outcome 4, which was to be able to deepen engagement with that work, to deepen engagement with the things that we were seeing happening all around in our local communities all around the globe, that we knew told a different story from the one that we were living through racial capitalism. So the next step was figuring out how to take the vision, translate it into outcomes, and then translate it into budget priorities. And I didn't include our entire budgets sheet here. I'm also happy to share that with anyone who would like to see, just like my colleagues. But I wanted to pull in or draw attention to a couple of pieces of what, how that story became actionable through where we chose to invest money in the budget. So one, there's very minimal support for us as PIs. We each received a summer 9th for the planning part and for being able to get the group up and running. But the majority, vast majority of the funds are going to support the people who are doing the work and to support growing that work. We wanted to resource differently the people who are coming to form the core group of 12 academics, activists, artists, educators, knowing that academics, this like sort of being part of a project like this makes sense. It's a thing that even I think with everything that Michael shared at the end about how does this register as research or service, and having to really make those fights individually within department, especially for more contingent faculty or tenure track faculty, that being part of an academic project or a project with a big vision like this is something that is more legible. And that's not the same reality that many of the activists that we wanted and artists that we wanted to have at the table were coming from. Many of them were also working in much more precarious positions. So we worked to differently resource the different members of our groups based on the actual material circumstances of their lives. And related to that, in comparing the graduate stipends from FSU, NYU, and Brown, our students make about a third of what Brown graduate students have negotiated right now. So one of the other ways that we wanted to materially invest in the vision of this project was by supporting beyond a graduate student stipend, offering additional support for at least one graduate student working on this project for its entirety. The next is really funding and resourcing mutual aid work to start off with a mini grant system. And this is something the foundation is very excited about as one way of radically redistributing funds. So we're building on a lot of models that are in their portfolio right now in doing this. But to start with a series of mini grants in the first year, to expand the possibility of that in the second year, and that in different ways, all of the people that are part of the core group would be involved with that. And the last is around the pieces of dissemination and resource sharing. And so investing again in the work to build a sort of accessible multimedia space for resource sharing, and similarly in building accessible spaces for digital dissemination, in addition to ones that people want to take on locally. This, I think, goes to a question that you've heard each of my colleagues reiterate. That was one that Carolyn put to us. That how, I think the question that you asked us was, how does this work advance your career? I inflected it slightly differently here, which is sort of trying to inflect it a bit in the spirit of what our work is. And the first piece that I wanted to say about what it has looked like for us to grow the work that matters to us is, for myself, as somebody who came out of a long organizing background before becoming an academic, which honestly is a lot of where I got my skills at building project budgets and doing this type of project layout work. A lot of the work that I do is illegible in my field right now. And this is the point that Michael said. That's something that I'm very acutely aware of as a junior faculty member. And so being able to do this work in the way that we were doing it with this level of support is a part of really answering this question of how religious studies can contribute to movements for change. It's also part of making space for ourselves in the field, making space for the legitimacy of this as a mode of doing religious studies. And that has really deep ripple effects, not only for us personally, but also for the many students who are coming after that we see asking these questions as the sort of mode of how they're entering the academy. And we broke that down in different ways for each of us. So I have my pieces of being the Southern anchor for this project. I'm also working in partnership with Dan, who really is trying to imagine building a graduate program, a sort of flagship graduate training program at Brown, and with Elaine, who's doing some of this work in the context of ethnographic methods and archival records. These are they're small snapshots of some of the ways that our research is showing up, but that was another piece that was really important for us, was recognizing that we are as much participants in this process as we are facilitators for it. And I think the last that I wanted to end on, which was the sort of the questions of myths, advice, different pieces, is it's helped each of us, I think, to really recognize that what we're doing within our field and maybe more broadly within the humanities is opening new horizons for what research can look like. That we are in fields that traditionally value single authorship and monographs especially. And that part of what this project is building is in the ways that we are documenting it steadily throughout are new methods of what rigorous community-driven collaborative research looks like in the humanities. And that is a huge piece to be centering at every step, especially when you have to do like work not only of translating what you're doing to other colleagues, to people outside of your field, but also to recognize that we're actively in the midst of building new frameworks. And that's something that started from the moment of applying for this grant, working with department leadership who are more familiar with different fellowship models as opposed to project. So that was thinking with our department about how we could dedicate graduate student time. Our department has really generously committed a graduate student stipend to be a full-time RA working with this project every single year. We've also talked in different ways about releases from course releases, because this grant does not support our time, and that's one of the priorities of the foundation, is not underwriting faculty salaries. So having to work with our department to be able to, or work with our departments to be able to make it actually feasible for us to do this work. I think it's been a similar and different set of questions with university leadership, and really how to think about the type of work we're doing as collaborative, non-hierarchical fellow PIs over a like laboratory model where this would be somebody's research. And then there would be people who came in underneath it. There are pieces that translate well and there are many that don't. So really getting into the muck to figure out how we build new language and new frameworks. And I will say that Laurel, while she was here, was just an absolute godsend and partner in doing this work. Our funder has a real limit, not only around not supporting faculty salaries, but also not supporting massive indirect costs for institutions. So we had to work on that, on an agreement that meant that actually no cent of this grant is going to support the incredible resources at the Office of Research and FSRF and everyone who has helped us. And that was one of the commitments of the foundation that we had to work with the university to make actionable. I talked a little bit already about cost sharing. I think a piece that I want to flag is making these sort of versions of commitments to different players requires really creative work with FSRF and with all of the team here at FSU to translate what our own budget priorities are into categories that are legible. And so to allow time and space for that, and really to fight for what you know, within what you know the integrity of the project requires, and to figure out what the language is that actually reflects that. So we went back and forth amongst things like stipends, honoraria, mini grants, and trying to figure out what the right language was that left people with the most flexibility to be working on this project. And then the last to say again is figuring out that for us, that type of non-hierarchical leadership was absolutely essential to what we were trying to build, and the ways that we were modeling mutual aid amongst ourselves. So it's been one of the more interesting pieces when you can only enter a single PI's name. How do you work to translate that from the grant interface to the to RAMP here at FSU and beyond? I think I've gone a couple of minutes over, so I'm going to cut here and thank you all very much.
Thank you so much, Laura. Thank you to all of our speakers, Ansje, Michael, and Laura. Those presentations were so helpful and images are so beautiful. Okay, I was hoping we would have time for question and answer. We really don't, but if anyone has questions, would send me an email. I will respond to you, and I probably will need to involve the speakers. I wanted to say last thing before we go, registration is now open for this semester's collaborative collision program. I'm putting the link in the chat, and Arts and Humanities faculty are very welcome, and there will be a topic that will be specifically carved out for that general area. It's an opportunity to expand your network of interdisciplinary collaborators and build your skills in collaboration for grant seeking. Okay, thank you so much to our guests. Very much appreciate the effort you put into your lovely presentations.